So, welcome to the new Physics Research Center, and you can see we're almost moved in. But I should just say this building was the Laboratory for Astrophysics and Space Research built by John Simpson. It was 2 stories, but John was a visionary in many ways, including many of the things that Leo Szilard worked on. And he built the first 2 floors, but built it so one could have 3rd and 4th floors. And I welcome you to go up to the other floors because they've done a beautiful job on the building. So we're just moved in. So it's a great pleasure to introduce William Lanouette. Bill graduated from Fordham in English and philosophy and has a PhD in political science from the London School of Economics. And he has a remarkable CV. In fact, he's a challenge to somebody introducing him. I didn't know quite where to. Yeah, exactly. I did. I can give you a copy. But it's a remarkable CV. He's worked as a staff member with Congress, the World Resources Institute, U.S. Government Accountability Office, National Observer. He was the Washington staff member from our own Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for a number of years. He has written for The Atlantic, The Economist, Washington Post, Scientific American, NPR, PBS, and many others. And he's author of many book chapters and encyclopedia entries, and I challenge you to look at the spread because it's really remarkable. Nuclear power, defense of learning, the persecution and placement of academic refugees, nuclear energy, and the legacy of Harry Truman, among others. And in particular, how I came across Bill was The Voice of the Dolphins is one of the most visionary books I've ever seen by Leo Szilard. And I really recommend this. The press is planning to reissue this. It's out of print, and all the cheap copies on the web are largely gone because I bought them all. But if you have it, I really recommend reading this. It's science fiction, but it's visionary. And Szilard has solutions to problems rather than just talk about problems. He knows how to solve them. Unfortunately, he was regarded by many as a flake because he had solutions to problems. And everybody knows you can't solve them. And lastly, I just want to say that led me to this book. Going through Jim Cronin's books, I found Genius in the Shadows by Bill. And it's a wonderful book. And there's a new edition of this. Okay, and so I recommend this highly because Szilard is he and Fermi are really the 2 key scientific drivers of what we see. There are also, we reprinted up some of Leo's 10 Commandments, and they're out on the table. You're welcome to take those, and we can make more if need. So I give you Bill.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here in the shadow of Szilard, and I have to get the right notes. Because of unfortunate, the mic okay?
Turning it on.
Oh, that helps.
You're all set.
Yeah. Because of unfortunate circumstances, Richard Rhodes is in the hospital with pneumonia, and so I'm going to be Richard Rhodes this afternoon. Anyway, welcome to Leo Szilard, the visionary in science and society. Now, if he had his way, we wouldn't be here at all. We would probably be at a blimp hangar in New Jersey, or a golf course in Yonkers, or a polo ground in New Jersey. Because that's where he and Herb Anderson went to find potential sites for the first reactor. But of course, their whole operation was moved here, and so here we are in the shadow, or the neighborhood of the squash court. In this talk on Leo Szilard, a visionary innovator in science and society, I'll give you some background about this remarkable man, then describe his creative approach to both science and to society, and end with a few of his many ideas that might yet be helpful to us today. 5 Nobel laureates appreciated Szilard for his visionary imagination, and 2 thanked him for their prize. Biologist Francois Jacob calls Szilard an intellectual bumblebee for how he loved to share ideas. Biologist Jacques Monod was at first shocked by Szilard's quizzical approach. Many of the questions seemed very unusual, startling, almost incongruous. I was not sure I understood them all, especially since he insisted on redefining the basic problems in his own terms rather than mine. Monod and Jacob received the Nobel Prize for work Szilard had suggested, and in his 1965 Nobel lecture, Monod said, "It was Szilard who decisively reconciled me to the idea, repulsive to me until then, that enzyme induction reflected an anti-repressive effect rather than the reverse, as I had tried unduly to stick to." Physicist Hans Bethe said that his friend and colleague Leo Szilard was a very complex personality. He was one of the most intelligent people I have ever met. His mind worked quickly and profoundly, and he was able to come to ideas that most of us appreciated only after many hours of talk. This was his strength and, of course, also his weakness. He was always ahead of his time. His ideas often were expressed in paradoxes, and the paradoxes were not always understood. Biologist James Watson said Szilard had influenced him more than anyone else, not for any particular scientific idea, but for his soaring imagination. Watson said he loved being around him because Leo got excited about something before it was true. And Szilard's Hungarian colleague Eugene Wigner claimed if the Manhattan Project could have been run on ideas alone, no one but Leo Szilard would have been needed. I have some images, and rather than try to time my talk to the images, I'm just going to give you a little Szilard slideshow with a couple of tips as to what they are, but you'll hear about most of them a little later on. This is a cartoon that was done for the New York Times for the review of the book when it first came out in 1993. Szilard loved sitting in the bathtub and thinking up ideas like Archimedes. This is the latest edition of the book, came out in 2013 with some additions, new pictures, and a new introduction. This is where he grew up in Budapest in a villa, 3 generations. It's now a dormitory for a music conservatory. There he was as a young man. As you'll see in the book, he once lost that hat in a fight with an elephant at the Budapest Zoo. Here he is in the Army. As you see, a not too pleased artillery cadet. Here he is as a student in Berlin. This is a David Levine sketch, which the New York Review of Books used for a review. This is the King's Crown Hotel near Columbia, where he first met Enrico Fermi and where they lived for a while, and where Szilard lived most of his life in the United States. Somebody said he had an office in Chicago, lived in a hotel in New York, and had a wife in Denver. Here he is in 1935 with E.O. Lawrence. And here he is with Eugene Wigner in New York City in the 30s. This is a posed picture of him drafting the letter to FDR about the German A-bomb program. It's part of Atomic Power, a 1946 March of Time documentary in which all the scientists played themselves. Now, the Manhattan Project began in June, I think it was June of 1942, and General Groves took over in September. You may have heard that Oppenheimer and von Neumann were big fans, not of Manhattans, but of martinis. And I guess if they had their way, it would have been the Martini Project. This is a little too small to see, but it's a redrawing of the first pile. And this is the balcony where they're making calculations. I think that's supposed to be Szilard, Fermi, and Compton. Now, this is a bad copy. I couldn't find the original print of a picnic during the Manhattan Project on Lake Michigan with Eugene Rabinowitz, who was very close to Szilard, both during the war and after. This was taken 4 years after the anniversary in 1946 on the steps of Eckerd Hall. Here he is with Norman Hilberry in front of Stagg Field just before it was demolished. Here he's testifying in Congress on taking the bomb and atomic energy away from the Army and giving it to a civilian AEC. Here he is on the left is Harold Urey with Szilard. At the time they were lobbying Congress for civilian control. And here he is in 1946 with Thorfinn Hagnes, who is from the university, is second from the right on the top row, and Urey lower left. So the Chicago people worked closely with Einstein after the war. Here's a picture of an article about them lobbying, along with Sam Allison, who is second from the left. This was taken after the Reds have the A-bomb. He was very active in Pugwash areas with Henry Kissinger and Eugene Rabinowitz at a 1961 Pugwash conference. This is at Cold Spring Harbor, the biology lab with Max Delbruck, Aaron Novick, Szilard's colleague, and James Watson. Here he is at Cold Spring Harbor studying bacteriophage. This is the lab he set up in an abandoned synagogue just south of the Midway with Aaron Novick when he was at least a half-time professor of biology here in the 1950s. He loved what he called botching, just sitting and thinking, and he would do it by the hour. Here he is in the Colorado Rockies, just like Buddha sitting there botching. This is a radio program about the bomb in 1950 with Hans Bethe, Fred Seitz, and Harrison Brown, who was also for a while at the university. This is the first Pugwash conference in 1957. He was very active in Pugwash. This is a cruise on the first conference. The left is Joseph Rotblatt, and some of you may know Ruth Adams, who for a long time was editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. Here he is in the hospital in 1960 with his wife, Trudy. It was while he was there that he wrote The Voice of the Dolphin. And he took over the lobby of a hotel near the White House to lobby the Kennedy administration. He said the room was too dark, so he just made this his office. And the Ten Commandments you've seen. Here he is at a panel talking about the Ten Commandments with Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1960s. And here he is with William During. He and During proposed what became the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. And here he is making a pitch to Jonas Salk to take up this study center idea. This was taken at the Waldorf in 1957. Here he is with Salk and Francis Crick in the last months of his life while he was at the Salk Institute. This is his headstone at the Kerepesi Cemetery in Budapest, where half his ashes are buried. The other half are buried in Ithaca, New York, with his wife and her family. This is a favorite sketch. It's by Eva Zeisel, who was married to Hans Zeisel, a professor here, and who knew Leo Szilard for a long time. Well, Szilard was born in Budapest in 1898 in an assimilated Jewish family. He grew up in a villa where he was educated by tutors and a French governess until he went to high school. Also born in his neighborhood were three other physicists who later joined him in work on the Manhattan Project. They were John von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller. At the project, these four Hungarians were called the Martians. Why? Because they were superhumanly intelligent and spoke an unearthly language. Szilard's engineering studies were interrupted during the First World War when he was a less than enthusiastic artillery cadet in the Austro-Hungarian army. Later, he said his hobby was baiting brass hats, and throughout World War II, Szilard was in constant conflict with General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project. Groves even once tried to have Szilard jailed as an enemy alien. In 1919, Szilard fled Budapest and the fascist Horthy regime to study engineering and then physics in Berlin. When Szilard applied for a course by Max Planck, who had created quantum theory, he first had to meet the professor. "I only want to know the facts of physics," Szilard told Planck. "I will make up the theories myself." Szilard's 1923 doctoral thesis devised his basis for information theory by combining what we now call a bit of information with a quantity of entropy. He taught courses in Berlin with John von Neumann, Erwin Schrödinger, and Lisa Meitner. There he also met Max Delbruck and explored with him the idea of quitting physics to study biology, which Szilard saw as the next theoretical field. Szilard met and befriended Albert Einstein. The two enjoyed lateral thinking on a wide range of topics. Szilard and Einstein shared more than 30 patents for an electromagnetic pump, first used for household refrigerators in the 30s and in the 50s and 60s to cool nuclear breeder reactors. In fact, Szilard also thought up and named the breeder and drew designs for 3 of them here at the Met Lab. According to physicist Alvin Weinberg, Szilard proposed the name breeder in 1943 when he, Eugene Wigner, and Szilard were walking in the quadrangle. With Hitler's rise in 1933, Szilard fled Berlin for London. Szilard, a visionary in science, somehow Szilard saw the future everywhere he looked. In the 1920s, he proposed the idea of an electron microscope, designed a linear accelerator, and applied for a patent on a cyclotron, all before others developed these machines. He also worked in Berlin with Hermann Mark to study the nature of X-rays. Standing on a street corner in London in 1933, he thought up the nuclear chain reaction and a critical mass to sustain it, and patented these concepts and had them classified military secret, fearing the Germans might discover his work. At Columbia University, with Fermi in 1939, they co-designed the world's first nuclear reactor. Their joint patent was published in 1955, a year after Fermi's death. Szilard made a key contribution to their success by proposing to use pure graphite as their moderator. Commercial graphite had boron that ate up neutrons, and he insisted and found pure graphite. As a result, their pile worked and the German piles did not. In the 1930s, he devised the Szilard-Chalmers effect for isotope separation and experimented with radiation to cure cancer and to preserve food. In the 1950s, Szilard proposed a way to clone mammalian cells. Here at the university with Aaron Novick, he devised a chemostat to control the growth rate of microorganisms. The machines had to maintain a 98-degree temperature, but Szilard found it easier to heat the whole room rather than the machines. So he had researchers sweating in there in shorts and T-shirts. In 1960, Szilard contracted bladder cancer. Refusing surgery, he designed an original radiation treatment that cured him. In the 50s and 60s, he wrote original papers on the nature of aging, ways to suppress cancer, and the brain's memory and recall. He was also a visionary in society. He loved dreaming up new institutions to solve all the world's problems. In 1919, he founded a Socialist Students Association to help clarify political and economic conflicts between Hungary's communists and royalists. In the 1920s, he devised a Bund to select the best and brightest students in Europe and trained them for work in government. In London in the 1930s, he helped organize the Academic Assistance Council, which aided thousands of refugee scholars. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1934, he proposed enlisting Nobel laureates to protest, the first time this august group was politicized in this way. Fearing German advances in atomic research, he proposed that Fermi and others do something very unscientific, that they censor their own research. Some did and some didn't. In the eve of World War II, he proposed and drafted the letter by Einstein to President Franklin Roosevelt warning about German A-bomb work. With this letter on its way, Szilard sat down and was moved to compose his own 10 Commandments. I think he feared what was coming ahead. Einstein's letter prompted FDR to convene an advisory committee on uranium, but months later, when the committee's promising funding did not materialize, he enlisted Einstein in a little-known effort at political blackmail. He drafted for Einstein a letter warning the White House that if these funds were not forthcoming, Szilard might just publish a paper detailing just how a chain reaction in uranium could work. Soon Fermi and Szilard had their money. With Germany clearly defeated, Szilard enlisted Einstein to write a fourth letter to FDR. Einstein said, "My only role in this was as Leo Szillard's mailbox." He urged the president in March of 45 to meet Szilard and hear about his views on post-war controls of their still secret work. Roosevelt died before receiving that letter, and when Szilard took it to the Truman White House in May, he was sent to Spartanburg, South Carolina to meet with James F. Burns, Truman's advisor on atomic matters. The scientist who had made the bomb and wanted to stop it there met the politician who couldn't wait to drop it. Returning here in Chicago, in June of 45, Szilard and the chemist Eugene Rabinowitz drafted the Franck Committee report headed by Nobel laureate James Franck and signed by 7 scientists, urging the Secretary of War to organize a demonstration of the bomb before using it on cities. General Groves feared Szilard would somehow publicize plans to use the bomb, and Rabinowitz was even tempted to leak the press that an A-bomb was about to be used. In 1971, Rabinowitz wrote the New York Times, "25 years later, I feel I would have been right if I had done so." When the Franck report was ignored in Washington, Szilard drafted a petition to the president urging moral considerations before using the bomb against civilians. Groves learned about the petition and ordered lab director Arthur Compton to poll the scientists to see what they really believed. And Groves was miffed to learn that 83% favored a demonstration. In September 45, Szilard urged President Hutchins to organize a conference on atomic energy policy, which he did. Franck and 64 other scientists and academics from the university sent President Truman a petition urging him to share atomic secrets with other nations to avoid a nuclear arms race. Also on campus, the Atomic Scientists of Chicago was established to work for international control of the atom, and in December founded the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. From here, Szilard led lobbying to take control of atomic energy away from the Army and put it in a new civilian Atomic Energy Commission. He enlisted Dean Robert Redfield and sociologists Edward Shills to help lobby for civilian control, and help physicist Catherine Way to edit a book, One World or None, an influential account by all the scientists urging international control of atomic energy. In 1946, the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, headed by Einstein, included from Chicago Szilard, Harold Urey, and Thorfinn Hognes. The committee worked to educate the public about nuclear weapons. In 1947, he published an open letter to Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, proposing that Stalin address the American people directly by radio and that President Truman address the Russians directly. Obviously, that didn't happen. In 49, Szilard wrote in the University of Chicago Law Review a political satire, My Trial as a War Criminal. It translated into Russian, it prompted Soviet physicist Andrei Sakharov to reconsider his work on weapons of mass destruction. Beginning in the 50s, Szilard proposed off-the-record exchanges to discuss arms control with Soviet scientists. He always thought scientists were rational and they could avoid the pitfalls of political consideration. It was an idea that led eventually to the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs in 1957. In 1960, Szilard met Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in a private meeting when Khrushchev was at the UN, and he gained his assent to the idea of a Moscow-Washington hotline. In 1962, Szilard created the first political action committee for arms control and disarmament, the Council for a Livable World, which is still active on Capitol Hill. He aimed to elect senators who favor arms control treaties. To economize, he targeted candidates from the least populous states where their election would be least costly. His first winner was George McGovern from South Dakota. In the 1960s, Szilard proposed a European Biology Study Center modeled on CERN in Geneva. This became EMBO, the European Molecular Biology Organization in Heidelberg, where the library is named in Szilard's honor. In 1957, Szilard and chemist William Deering proposed a research center that would study both biology and the social problems created by science. In 1960, this became the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in San Diego. Szilard was among the Salk Institute's first fellows, and he died there of a heart attack May 30th, 1964, at the age of 66. What about all these ideas? Szilard tossed out so many ideas that often even he didn't know whether he was serious or kidding. Fermi found Szilard exasperating for telling others everything they should do and for seeming to enjoy tossing off ideas meant to be shocking. And Einstein chided Szilard for overestimating the role of reason in human life. Beyond his relentless reason, Szilard also wrote science fiction and political satire to make some of his most important points. His 1960 fable, The Voice of the Dolphins, described a worldwide television network that broadcast impartial discussion of political problems with no commercials, to clarify policy issues for the public and their leaders. And to assure that leaders did the right thing, a secret international source funded a foundation to give politicians millions of dollars for life if they resign. During the debates about whether to test nuclear weapons, Szilard broke with his colleagues who proposed various test ban treaties. No, he said, you should test them. Test them all, every last one. Szilard also proposed ways to improve science. He suggested the National Science Foundation give all scientists a lifetime limit on the number of papers they could publish. And scientists should be funded not for any particular research project, but simply to allow them the leisure to relax and think creatively, just as he loved to do. Stagg Field, on the night of December 1st, 1942, 75 years ago, Szilard invited the psychologist Henrik Kluver out to dinner. When walking to a nearby restaurant, Szilard admitted he had already eaten, but would have a second dinner just in case. Just in case what? Kluver asked over dinner. Just in case an important experiment doesn't succeed, said Szilard with a typical air of mystery. He added that he and other scientists knew that something might well work, but another more remote possibility was that it might work too well. And that prompted his second dinner. On the afternoon of December 2nd, after their experiment worked very well, Szilard and his colleagues sipped Chianti and then filed out of the squash court. The fear of nuclear weapons that first startled Szilard on a street corner in London 9 years before had been confirmed. Szilard and Fermi found themselves standing alone. I shook hands with Fermi, Szilard remembered, and I said I thought this day would go down as a black day in the history of mankind. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
I'll have plenty of time because I know what a lively character he is and the ideas he inspires. Yes, sir. Are we using this mic?
Yeah, we probably should. I think Mary would like us to use the mic because she's recording it.
There you go.
So it's not quite directed.
A neighbor of ours was a teenager in 1945, and when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, it appeared on the newspapers on the newsstand, and this neighbor of ours saw Szilard look at the newspapers on the stand and go running down the street, completely surprised and taken aback.
Yeah. He suspected that there would be a test because all the phone connections to Los Alamos were cut off from here. But he didn't know exactly when the bomb would come, but he feared that it would come. And of course it did, and he was shot. Somebody told me, I think it was Gino who told me about Szilard's reaction when Kennedy was assassinated. How do we get to Johnson? Well, he was always thinking ahead about what to do next, even in the face of tragedy.
Other questions?
Gino.
Here, let me give you the mic. Okay, thanks.
There is a story that in June of 1954, right after the famous Watson-Crick paper, Watson came to Cold Spring Harbor at Max Delbruck's invitation and gave a presentation of their model of the DNA. And Szilard had some interesting remarks about that.
I'm not familiar with that session, no.
I think what he said is...
you probably heard this from Watson.
No, what he said was immediately, Szilard raised his hand and said, "Have you thought of patenting it?"
Which he loved to do. He was criticized in the 1930s for filing patents, but he never really had a reliable job. He was always a teaching assistant or something like that. And so he filed these patents as a way to survive economically, but at the time he was scorned. And even only later on, I think, did it become common for science to patent it. But now it's all the rage.
Other question?
Did he give any courses
Here at Chicago?
No. He had a two halftime appointments. One in what is it?
Do the mic.
I should. I should remember. It's halftime in biophysics, and then halftime in an institute to study social problems, which was run by Edward Shills. Fermi didn't really want him to be in the Fermi Institute. They didn't get along very well, although they had to collaborate and did. But he was also by that time eager to get back to biology. In 1930, I think it was, or 31, he and Max Delbruck in Berlin were talking about biology. And in 33, when Szilard got to London, he wanted to study biology. He went to A.V. Hill, another physicist who became a biologist at the University of London, and said, "I want to study biology." And so he said, "Well, I'll make you a physiology instructor and you can pick it up that way and then you can get into the course." And he was this is September of 1933, he was about to do that, and then standing on that street corner, He thought up the chain reaction. So it was 1956 before he really got back to biology. And it led, he once told Niels Bohr, he said in 1950, he says, well, I'm dividing my time, half time between saving the world and studying biology. And since the world is in such a mess, I have plenty of time to study biology. But he did for the rest of, after the war, combine arms control work with the serious study of biology, which he did all over the place at the NIH and eventually at the Salk Institute. Sir. You want to do it? Yeah.
On this similar topic, it's on. On this similar topic, what do you think as a younger man inspired him to be interested in biology? To me, that's a mystery as to why anyone would.
He thought
He's my graduate student.
he thought physics was finished. I mean, they had quantum theory and they had electrodynamics and they had all these Nobel laureates sitting around in Berlin, but he thought that the nuclear physics, it was long before fission, was wrapped up, and he was looking for the next theoretical subject. And he thought biology would be the next theoretical subject. Now, a number of physicists turned biologists, including Francis Crick and others, have said that this was really a misnomer, that really the approach to physics and to biology are very different because of the way biology evolves. Szilard loved biology because he could get experiments done in hours rather than days or weeks. And he also, I think, wanted to see the human application of biology to medicine. His friend Jacob Bronowski said that he had forsaken physics and death for biology and life, which is a little overstated. But anyway, Bronowski overstated a lot of things. But it was a shift that was, I think, psychological in terms of looking at something that really helped people as opposed to living in the shadow of the bomb. Yes, sir.
Did he have any thoughts about artificial intelligence and the future of computers? Did he spend any time thinking about that?
He didn't. You know, Shannon wrote to him in the 1950s when they were having an information theory conference, I think at Bell Labs. And he wrote back and he said, well, I thought about this in the 20s, but I haven't given it any more thought. And he really didn't. Now, he did teach a course or two with John von Neumann and probably talked, by this time Szilard's paper on information had been published, and he probably talked to von Neumann about it, but Szilard loved giving other people ideas. And so he never really did follow up on this very seminal concept about the basis for information theory.
Oh, here, Harry wants to record this.
Was he a part of Jason Group?
No, he was never a member of the Jasons. No, he was on
Reason
the
for that?
Pardon?
Is there a reason for that? Is there explanation for that?
Well, I think he was always suspected of being a Soviet spy, or at least a troublemaker. The Jasons in the early days was very establishment-oriented and worked almost exclusively for the Pentagon. And Szilard would not have enjoyed that very much. On the other hand, he wanted to be a roving professor where he would go from one place to another, to NIH, to Rockefeller Institute, to Harvard, and run around and just be this intellectual bumblebee that he was. And he wasn't ever establishment enough, I think, to get in on the Jasons. And frankly, if he had been in, he probably would have been a real troublemaker. He at the Pugwash conferences, there was one Pugwash conference where he showed up on the first day with the final report that he thought they should issue. And then he debated about it for a couple of days, and then in the end, he voted against it. So, what are you going to do? Oh, yeah, yeah.
Thanks. So earlier you mentioned a point that I found fascinating that you mentioned Szilard being fearing Germans' advances in atomic research and advocated for scientists to censor their research
Right.
and to varying degrees of reception. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit and whether or not this was a method he still advocated after the surrender of the Germans.
He certainly was afraid of the Germans. He had studied with the best German physicists in the world. He actually got the idea of an atomic bomb from H.G. Wells, who he met in London. There's a book called The World Set Free, which, written before the First World War, predicts an atomic war in the 1950s in which all the cities, big cities of the world are destroyed. So, but it wasn't until the neutron was discovered in 1932 that Szilard got beyond the usual thinking of bombarding things with alpha particles and realized that possibly you could split the nucleus of an atom. He didn't know which one. He mentioned several in his patent, including uranium, but never tested it. So he thought, well, if I can think of this, and I was just a part-time professor, I'm sure the best minds of Germany can figure this, and he had fled Nazi Germany. And in fact, he got out the day before they started checking people at the border. He said, in this life, it's not necessary to be smarter than other people, just one day earlier. But he feared the Germans very much. He wrote to Fermi in the 30s and said, would you stop publishing this? You know, they were bombarding different materials. Fermi resented that very much. They met briefly at a conference in London and apparently had an argument about this whole idea of censoring scientific work. But Szilard said, I invented secrecy long before the military took over. He had Victor Weisskopf writing to the French in 1939, urging them not to publish their research. He wanted to control this because he feared so much of what a German A-bomb would do. After the war, and he tried to publish his petition in Science magazine, and General Groves stamped it secret. Before that, it wasn't secret. It was just a citizen writing to the president. So Szilard concluded after that, and it wasn't published finally until 1962. So he concluded that the most powerful weapon to come from the Manhattan Project was not the A-bomb, it was the secret stamp. Yes.
If Szilard were here today, what kinds of things might he suggest about some of these issues?
Boy, I wish I knew. If you ask me in 10 years, I can answer it, because he was always about 10 years ahead of us. I know he loved, and I think one of his commandments is looking at the interconnectedness of things. And I'm sure that if he were looking at global warming, he'd be looking at more than just the physical effects of pollutants or the patterns of atmospheric change. He'd be looking at some kind of a social key or something else that would somehow unite these forces in a positive way. In the case of The Voice of the Dolphins, he wrote it in 1960, predicting in the end of the 80s how the nuclear arms race would end. So it was kind of a future history. And in that, he has an institute set up in Vienna with Russian and American scientists. He always liked talking with the Russians, thought they were really worth the effort of collaborating with. And they developed something called amyris, which is a food nutrient that's also a contraceptive. And so this revolutionizes the world. And then he talks about them using the money that they get from all the Nobel Prizes they win and all the Emrys they sell to run this radio program that's just going, a TV program which is going to educate the world to the real issues. So I mean, the fact he would think up something like this nutrient that was also a contraceptive, and then make fun of the Catholic Church's attitude towards it, for example, was, I mean, he just kept blending one field into another. He couldn't stop thinking.
Did I hear correctly that he had cancer in the 50s and that he used his own ideas?
Yes, he did. Yeah, he contracted bladder cancer in 1959, and his wife was a medical doctor, and she ran a number of surveys on the survival rate of surgery, and he saw that it was pretty low, and so he refused to have surgery, but he devised a radiation method for himself at New York Hospital. What he did, he's at the time, most radiation was a general dose over a long period of time at a rather low level. And he thought of the opposite. He said, let's have a strong dose over a very short period of time, but have it targeted. And he got some isotopes from friends at Brookhaven, and he tried this, and it worked.
Okay, one last question, but then I just want to say there's still coffee and maybe muffins outside. Last question.
So thanks for your talk. One of the scientists who's usually considered one of the nuclear heroes, like Szilard, is Hans Bethe,
Yes.
who also emigrated from Germany, who's usually seen as a hero in the post-war scientific world for
He's seen as
a hero for opposing Edward Teller and
Oh, yes.
testifying in favor of Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
However, recently it's come out that Bethe himself, who's usually seen as an arms control hero, actually well into the 1970s had contracts with many defense companies to do studies for them and develop projects for them. So my question is, Bethe is also seen as a hero. Don't you think it's a little dangerous to lionize and heroize a single person like this? Don't you think it's a little dangerous in this day and age to do that?
Well, when I was I didn't know about that. When I was praising Bethe, it was for his earlier work with Szilard, starting certainly by 1946 with the Emergency Committee to become public and advocating to the public ways to control nuclear weapons. It's of course dangerous to lionize anybody, as all the men on TV news shows are finding out. But I think you could look at Szilard and you could criticize him for a number of things. He was ambivalent about weapons. He first wanted to prevent them, then he wanted to accelerate the race, and finally he wanted to outlaw them. But consider this about Szilard, who we see as this hero. In 1944, he advocated bombing enemy cities because he said only the effect of this weapon will shock the world into the international control, and he thought under the new UN, that would be necessary to control all uranium and all nuclear materials. Well, by the spring of 45, he put that aside. But I mean, there was a time when you could say, sure, he thought what a number of military leaders later thought, that the shock value of this was the reason to use the weapon, certainly not the military purpose. And you could look at other things that he said that, contrary to what we would say is an informed view of the world. In terms of Bethe, I found him to be thoroughly admirable as a scientist, and he was ambivalent, I think, when it came to the H-bomb. For example, he first opposed the H-bomb, but later did some work on it. So I think you're right that we can't simplify certain historical people for just the views we like about them, that there are other things as well. You know,
Go ahead.
And just a footnote, as an example, I think in 1952, the United States Atomic Energy Commission had a scientific advisory
right.
9 members. And when they were asked whether they recommended a crash program to build the hydrogen bomb, they voted 9-0 against it. They were then overruled for political reasons.
Right.
And a crash program was initiated. And furthermore, the president ordered a gang on these scientists. They were not to reveal why they voted 9.
Mm-hmm.
But at a certain point, it's also true that a political decision is made. Oh, do this. Tricky issues.
Well, Fermi,
Nobody put published
Fermi and Robbie said that on this committee said that the H-bomb was a weapon of genocide, and later they worked on it. When in the context of will the Russians get this first?
And they also decided because they felt it wouldn't work and a crash program was the wrong idea. And when it looked like you could build a
Mm-hmm.
things are coming.
Yeah.
Hey, nobody orders you.
Yeah. Exactly.
Just at this point, we thank Bill, and then we take up outside.